The history of heavy.
Hello and welcome to the History of Heavy podcast, episode 17, if you can believe it, David. This is the show that traces the chronology of heavy music across genres. I'm not going to redo this take. It is across genres, song by song. I am one of your two co-hosts, Michael Huntsman, and I am joined by my forever co-host in life, Big Daddy Dr. Dave, Mr. Dave Lieberman. Hello, Dave. How are you? That was a very strange start.
At your service, sir. That's all right. I like that we're on episode 17 and we're closing in on the 159th episode faster than you could believe.
We are. It's very exciting. It does feel, it has felt like an ominous task. We have a very ambitious slate. You can check it out on our Spotify playlist. That is the History of Heavy podcast playlist on Spotify that details every song we have and will talk about on the show, although it is dynamic and always changing. We just talked about that last night about, potential, some alternates and substitutions and whatever. But still, it's crazy how fast we got to 17. And I'm in a headspace with this thing where I'm kind of excited about each episode. Last week, we talked about Led Zeppelin, which was obviously a big deal. We have a topic that I'm excited about tonight. So we'll get into that. I am recording in what seems like, behind some Anne Frank bookshelf in some attic somewhere. It is not. These are temporary digs for a place that my wife and I are renting out in the woods of Northern California while she recuperates for some surgery. She is fine. Thank you for asking. But I am in this oddly shaped, oddly colored room. I tried the sort of background, the faux background, but I hate the way that kind of makes it's no good. So this is what we're going to deal with if you're on YouTube. If you are listening on just an audio podcast, that might be just as well. But excited to dig into tonight. We are still in 1969. We have a good number of episodes in this year, as we did with 1968, as we will with 1970. But we are in 1969, and we spent last week's Cultural Corner talking about the aforementioned Led Zeppelin in detail. So I assume, David, you are gonna explore the larger cultural happenings in said year. So I will hand it off to you, my friend, to take us into your Cultural Corner.
Well, thank you, sir. As you mentioned, we're spending a few songs in 1969, and it's just as well because these are dynamic and volatile times. So to give you some idea of what's going on when these songs are happening, I'm, full disclosure, I'm taking some greatest hits from Wikipedia. I'm not a historian, and this is not a history of history podcast. So this is just to give you a flavor of what's going on in the background of these songs. And it occurred to me putting this together that in just the last 3 years of music that we've talked about, an enormous amount of cultural upheaval, technological innovation, world events have really underpinned the music that's going on. And so the sounds that you're hearing are coming out of this cauldron of world events. And so if you haven't had a chance, go back and listen to the earlier stuff. Who cares about our discussion? What you want to pay attention to is my Cultural Corner. It's a shameless plug for my little corner here. But all that background said, we're in a period where there's a lot of stuff going on with the Vietnam War. There's a lot of political upheaval around the world. There's a lot of stuff going on with the space program, various space programs. The US and Soviet space programs are competing right now. And so with that, let me tell you a couple things that happened in just May, June, July, and August, because we've still got another 1969 song to do, so we're going to break it up some more. May 15th, an American teenager known as Robert R. dies in St. Louis, Missouri, United States, of a baffling medical condition. In 1984, it will be identified as the earliest confirmed case of HIV/AIDS in North America. May 26th to June 2nd, John Lennon and Yoko Ono conduct their second bed-in. The follow-up to the Amsterdam event is held at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, Quebec. Quebecois. Lennon composes and records the song Give Peace a Chance during the event. June 28th, the Stonewall riots, a milestone in the modern gay rights movement in the United States, began in New York City. July 7th, French is made equal to English throughout the Canadian national government. I thought that was appropriate because we were just in Quebec with the Lennon-Ono family. July 16th, Apollo 11. Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins lifts off from Cape Kennedy in Florida towards the first crewed landing on the moon. A couple days later, 3 days later, July 19th, Chappaquiddick incident. This was a big deal. U.S. Senator Edward M. Kennedy drives off a bridge into a tidal pond after leaving a party on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts, killing Mary Jo Kopechne. Kennedy does not report the accident for 9 or 10 hours. This is a big political scandal that haunts the Kennedy family for generations. The next day, July 20th, at 3:17 p.m. Eastern Time, Apollo 11's lunar module, Eagle, lands on the moon. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern, an estimated 650 million people worldwide, the largest television audience for a live broadcast at this time, watch in awe as Neil Armstrong takes his first historic steps on the surface. Cannot underscore, cannot overstate how big of a deal that is. Humanity, all of the history of humanity, all the anthropological pre-human ancestors of mankind to this moment getting off planet and touching another celestial body is nuts to me to think about. Same day, July 20th, Tour de France, Belgian Eddy Merckx wins the cycle race for the first time. He is still living, a former professional road and track cyclist racer who is the most successful rider in the history of competitive cycling. His achievements were nuts. I fell into a little YouTube hole or a wiki hole with him. August 9th, we're still in 1969, August 9th, on orders from Charles Manson, members of the Manson family invade the LA home of film director Roman Polanski and murder his pregnant wife, the actress Sharon Tate, and 4 others. The next day, August 10th, a day after murdering Sharon Tate and 4 others, members of the Manson family kill Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in Los Angeles. August 14th, the Troubles begin. British troops are deployed in Northern Ireland to restore order following 3 days of political and sectarian violence, marking the beginning of the 37-year Operation Banner. This is the longest continuous deployment of British military history, which is saying a lot because they had the empire that the sun never set on, and there were lots of incursions throughout the world that they were involved in for many years. And then August 15th to August 18th, the Woodstock Festival is held near White Lake, New York, featuring some of the top rock musicians of the era. I mean, come on. This is 3-4 months in 1 year. And I'm skipping over all kinds of Ho Chi Minh dies, the My Lai massacre. Guy was convicted for the My Lai massacre. Um, Lots of stuff going on there in the Vietnam segment of history. It's just nuts to me that I've been doing this now and realize today, wow, this was really, really eventful period. And it makes sense that the music that we're talking about is the music of transition, the music of kind of celebration and protest and emotion, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot we've touched on without me connecting the dots, and it just kind of landed today. So lots and lots of going on.
Yeah, I mean, just a handful of those things you mentioned, Chappaquiddick and the moon landing and the Manson family murders, and Woodstock have all been the subject of many, many documentaries and books and TV shows and series and investigative reports and et cetera, et cetera. So to hear them just all rattled off as having happened over the span of several months is absolutely nuts.
Yeah, these things have been with us in our collective consciousness ever since. And so it's weird to look at the moment that it all happened and notice that they all happened at the same time. Just weeks apart.
Right. Crazy. Well, to bring it into tonight's topic and the broader topic of music that was happening at the time, I'm gonna take us a few years earlier to when the history of the MC5 began. And it begins in Detroit, Michigan in the early 60s, 8 or 9 years before everything Dave just told us, when future guitar icons Wayne Kramer and Fred Sonic Smith met as teenagers. The pair shared a love of R&B, the blues, and surf rock, and each would spend time in various local bands before forming what would become the MC5 with singer Rob Tyner, bassist Michael Davis, and drummer Dennis Thompson. The quintet gigged locally playing covers while they began to develop their sound and also their ideology as they became involved in Detroit's left-wing political scene. By 1966, the band had a large local following and would draw crowds of up to 1,000 people that included a young Iggy Pop and his fellow Stooges. They released their first single, a cover of Them's I Can Only Give You Everything, in 1967. And after two more singles in 1968, they booked national tours supporting the likes of Big Brother and the Holding Company and Cream, and generated a significant stir in those opening slots, with audiences regularly demanding that the Five perform multiple encores. This notoriety landed the band on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine in January 1969, as well as a contract with Elektra Records. That's the cover of Rolling Stone magazine before their debut LP had even hit shelves.
Yeah, that's nuts.
Yeah. By this point, the band's politics had intensified, and they became deeply influenced by the Black Panther Party, as well as by the beat poets of the day. Their musical influences had also involved and then included the free jazz of Albert Ayer, John Coltrane, and Sun Ra. All of these influences can be heard on their debut album, Kick Out the Jams, which was recorded live at the Grand Ballroom in Detroit, Michigan on October 30th and 31st, 1968, and released by Elektra Records in February of 1969. The album's lone single was released in March 69 and featured the title track backed with a cover of John Lee Hooker's The Motor City is Burning. For the single, the song's infamous command to kick out the jams, motherfuckers, was edited to kick out the jams, brothers and sisters. Still, there was a significant controversy around the song due to the obscenity, and the album was banned from multiple stores, including the Detroit-based department store called Hudson's. Not being the overly shy type, the Five responded in kind with a full-page ad in a local underground zine that read, "Stick alive with the MC5, fuck Hudson's." All the noise around the band was enough to sell over 100,000 copies of the album and push it to number 30 on the Billboard charts. But that would be proved to be the peak of the MC5's commercial success, as their final two proper albums, 1970's Back in the USA and 1971's High Time, each underperformed. However, the band's music and the song Kick Out the Jams, the subject of tonight's conversation in particular, would prove incredibly important as the years went on, influencing a who's who of garage rock, punk rock, and metal, including, but not exclusive to, the Stooges, the Sex Pistols, Nirvana, Sonic Youth, the Hives, and the White Stripes. The song has been covered hundreds of times, and notably by the Bad Brains, the Rollins Band, Rage Against the Machine, Monster Magnet, Blue Oyster Cult, and Pearl Jam. So, Dave, I say to you, it's time to kick out the jams, motherfucker.
Do it.
Tell me about your relationship with the MC5 and your broad thoughts about Kick Out the Jams.
So I got turned on to the MC5 many years ago in my exploration of punk and metal, probably in high school. I didn't find it edgy enough for what I was looking for at the time. 16, 17, I was very taking my edginess very seriously. And it seemed a little bit too approachable, if you will. Like, context is everything, right? Like, at the time, saying motherfucker was a big deal and got them a bunch of bad press and got them shunned. And when I get turned on to them, we've got gangster rap. And right. So it's like, it's a lot like looking at, old visual effects in movies, stop animation and whatever, versus computer animation, and being like, well, I don't know, I can't get into this movie because you can see how fake the effects are. So I got turned on to them a long time ago. I know of this sound and I know of this song, but I never really connected with it. Listening to it for tonight's episode, I was able to get into it a little bit more and better and appreciate it more. But that's where I came to it. Where did you find the MC5?
Yeah, so the MC5 are an interesting one for me. I, as we've talked around and about specifically on this show, I became a music fan as a very young child due to the influence primarily of my sisters. So was voraciously into music by the end of grammar school, 5th and 6th grade. And by the time, and now we would be kind of early 80s. By the time we get to the early 80s, I was consuming lots of different genres, more so than probably my peers at the time. But, things like the Beatles and Elton John, but also Alice Cooper and Aerosmith and Kiss, and then ultimately Iron Maiden and Van Halen and AC/DC, but also Steely Dan and Boz Scaggs and Elvis Costello, because I had these various influences. So the MC5 certainly should have been somebody that piqued my curiosity and I sought to explore, particularly as I got really into punk in what would have been junior high school, and took all of the learners courses in punk, the Pistols and the Clash and the Ramones and the Damned and the Jam and all the right bands, and ultimately the Stooges. Somehow missed the MC5. As we have oft talked, everybody has blind spots due to time and opportunity. And I am kind of embarrassed to admit I never heard Kick Out the Jams until 1990, when the soundtrack for the movie Pump Up the Volume was released. And on that soundtrack is the Bad Brains cover of Kick Out the Jams with Henry Rollins singing. And I was completely blown away, fell in love with it. And even after that, I put that song on a bunch of mixtapes, and I was a massive Bad Brains and Rollins fan and Black, into all that stuff. But even after all of that, it still took me several years to actually dig into the MC5. And I will say,
did you know it was a cover at that time?
I did. I can't remember how that happened exactly. Yeah, maybe not immediately, but shortly thereafter. I don't know if I find, whenever I found out, I didn't immediately go check out the MC5. It took me a long time before I eventually said, okay, this is obviously an important band that I kind of need to check out. That, this would have been now the mid 90s, or even, kind of into the later 90s. And my experience with the MC5 is kind of what you just described. I Other than this song and their version of this song, which I absolutely fell in love with by the time I got to the MC5, I love, love, love this song. But the rest of their material, the rest of this album, the rest of Back in the USA, which is the second album that have spent considerable time with over the years, have still never particularly moved me. They are a band that I have a deep respect for, and I really appreciate what they do, and particularly their political leanings and how outspoken they were, and graphically they did some really interesting things. But their music has always been a little too rock and roll for me. Or blue. I don't even know what it is, but I want it to be the Stooges, who are one of my favorite bands of all time. I want it to sound darker and more aggressive, instead of sounding kind of like party
Yeah.
energy,
Yeah.
I will say, to talk about the song tonight, and again, the song that we are talking about, I have heard thousands of times and love. The rest of the album, Kick Out the Jams, I haven't listened to front to back in probably years. Listened to it multiple times to have the conversation tonight. And in that week, week and a half, whatever it's been since I kind of began digging back in, I have enjoyed it more than I've ever enjoyed it. And specifically, what has really blown my mind about the record and the band, and this is obvious given their notoriety, is specifically Wayne Kramer and Fred Smith. That the guitar playing, like the solos and the stuff they are doing on guitar in 1969, is fucking awesome. Like just the tone of the guitars, the interplay between the two guitars, the soloing is really impressive given the context of what this band was in 1969. The songs themselves don't necessarily move me. I don't really love Rob Tyner's voice that much. But the song Kick Out the Jams is just like, I absolutely love. And in the context of this conversation about the history of heavy, absolute no-brainer. It was on my list from the very start of us talking about doing the show, and would have never moved, because I think it's a very important touchstone along this history, despite the fact that, I don't have a deep love or relationship with the MC5 themselves.
Wow. Interesting, because it's interesting to hear that. It's interesting to hear your relationship with them, because um, this project was something that came out of this was your instigation, and you compiled this list, and I'm kind of participating in it, but and happy to. But to know that this landed here more academically than emotionally is interesting for me, because I would put it here too academically. Like because I don't have that relationship with them, but because I know that they're so influential, and because I respect the movement that MC5 was, um, I wouldn't have it any other way. They have to be a part of the conversation. But it's interesting that neither of us have a relationship with the band.
Yeah, well, for sure, and everything you just said is right. Given their reputation and their influence and their political leanings and everything, they have to be included. This song has kind of chaotic energy that I love, that I wish the rest of their music had. I don't necessarily feel that way about most of their other music, but this song has like an intensity and kind of a pounding propulsion that I love, that is addictive to me, and it's heavy in a way that I don't think most of their music is heavy. You know, it's got almost a gallop to it, you know, where just the like propulsion of the snare drum, the dun 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 dun, I'm gonna kick it out. You know, it's very
Driving.
locomotive like to me. Like there's some Motorhead in MC5. You know, you can see traces of fucking almost everybody in this song. You know, it's
Sure.
very, I mean, shit, I play in a band with a couple of buddies that's called Mid City 3, MC3, that we are directly paying homage to the MC5. We sound nothing like, it's kind of an indie rock band, sounds nothing like the MC5, but they've been despite what I said about them, they are influential enough to me that I named a band after them. Like that's
Right.
you know?
Right. I think that's very telling, and that's kind of what I was getting at, is that you know, this is a song on this list that doesn't have to be here for any other reason than the impact that they had in the pantheon of music, much less our particular branch. Yeah, and you know, when we talk about a band's weight as being part of their heaviness, MC5 occurs to me as one of those bands that has a self-awareness. Like, they know who they are, they're unabashedly who they are, but they're not trying too hard to be who they are. They're really authentically this. And this is this manifestation of raw energy, but also they're smart and they're political and they're focused. You know, you mentioned that the Black Panthers were a big influence, to the point where they started a White Panthers chapter, right? Huey Newton of the Black Panthers, in response to a question of like, how can other people help support the Black Panthers? And he said, start a White Panther chapter. And so they did. Like, it wasn't just lip service. It wasn't their band persona. Their band was a sonic representation of their persona.
I'm really glad you framed it that way, and I've never considered it that way, but I think it's really a really interesting observation that they were smart. If you think about their peers, a bunch of the bands that I just rattled off, the Pistols, the Ramones, the Damned, the Stooges, all kind of dumb. You know, and I don't, that's no
A dumb
intellectual
persona,
judgment,
at least.
but they presented dumb.
Yeah.
You know, certainly the Clash and the Jam, and I mean there were exceptions to that, but I think that sort of intelligence that they presented was really important to their image, and honestly my respect for them, despite the fact that I don't necessarily love their catalog. I have a deep respect for them, and I think a lot of that is the smarts you just mentioned, although I've never articulated it that way.
Yeah, it really feels like it comes across. And I don't know how, but it's something that I've always understood about them. And this is from having a very cursory knowledge that the band exists, that they're from Detroit and they're from the 60s, and they predate all this, you know, they're sort of in the progenitor scene, right? They predate a bunch of other music. And that's all I really knew about them, yet this came through.
Right. Yeah. I was looking for a good place to stick this in, and I haven't found one, so I'm just gonna say it. I want to talk about genre and get your perspective there, but I do want to mention it because it's so great and under appreciated, I think. My again, my favorite song by far from the MC5, and it's not even close, is Kick Out the Jams. It's everybody's favorite song. But it's sort of the one, and I don't really think about the rest of the catalog. My second favorite song of theirs is not an MC5 song, but a song by a band that Fred Sonic Smith formed after the MC5 broke up. He formed a band called Sonic's Rendezvous Band. They only ever issued one single in 1974, and the song is called City Slang. And it is an absolute fucking ripper. It is a great, great song, and I didn't put it in my notes. I only thought of it as we were talking about how much I love that song. So I wanted to mention it here just as a recommendation for people to check it out. You can find it. I think you can find it on Spotify, but certainly on YouTube. City Slang by Sonic's Rendezvous Band is just an absolute jam, and it's the band that Fred Smith formed after the MC5 broke up. And they just never got a full head of steam and only kind of had one official release. I think they've had some, sort of compilations or whatever released posthumously, but absolutely worth checking out. And I think that song is a little more straightforward, and it's got kind of a more melodic hook, and it's less ramshackle than the MC5. And that song I would kind of call proto-punk, I guess, is what I would call it. Maybe that's what I would call Kick Out the Jams. So I want to ask you, what for Kick Out the Jams, I feel like you're particularly good at this game. What genre would you give it in the context of 1969?
Well, you stole my thunder. It was definitely proto-punk in my list. And part of the reason is the sound, but part of the reason is punk rock isn't a sound. Punk rock is an attitude,
right? Lifestyle,
and it's a lifestyle, and it's a movement. And what you hear is the lifestyle and the movement. And again, like, that's just a sonic manifestation of the attitude or the stream of consciousness that punk rock is. And so MC5 comes across to me very much as a sonic manifestation of their consciousness. So I'd call it proto-punk. I heard a lot of similarities sonically in that same family of fuzzy guitar as Blue Cheer.
Yeah.
And it's that warm, fuzzy 70s distortion.
Tube amps,
that is,
yeah.
Oh, I love it. I just love it. And that's a sonic heaviness for me, like that quality of that type of distortion, the type of bass tones you get out of that distortion, and the way that the guitar sound is frayed but punches through at the same time. Really hard to explain, but there's like this high note that's punching through the frayed distortion, and it's just such a great sonic texture that I think is very heavy. Meanwhile, their persona, their stream of consciousness, their motherfucker puts the stamp of punk rock.
Yeah.
The flag of punk rock before it was, even know how to spell punk rock.
Yeah, well said, and I agree. I think the only other genre or subgenre that comes close to describing them is garage rock. I think that's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
You can definitely hear that. Thinking about again, the White Stripes. I feel like there's there and the Sonics there, but the two that the two other genres that they're tagged under on Wikipedia anyway are hard rock and blues. And I don't really hear, I don't feel like they're either of those things, despite the fact that they do a John Lee Hooker cover. I don't really hear the blues in the MC5 the way you hear the blues in Cream or some of the other bands we've described
Right.
as electric
Yeah,
blues.
I think it's less that you hear it in them and more that they were influenced by that. Right. And that makes sense and that tracks, but I also didn't really it doesn't come through. I think that if you dissect it and unpack it, it's there, but you have to think about it. It doesn't connect that way. It doesn't present that way. But like you said, Cream, Blue Cheer, even the Sonics, there's a bluesiness to their chord progression and their song structure that is apparent on its face. That just didn't. It was layered under the attitude, the heavy distortion, and just raw energy. Guitar or garage rock is very accurate too, and I think that garage rock and punk rock are twins.
Yeah.
There isn't one without the other. Or, I mean, I guess you can have garage rock without punk rock, but you can't have punk rock without garage rock.
Right. Yeah. Well said. The album Kick Out the Jams came out 1 month after the first Led Zeppelin record that we talked about last week, and I opined kind of strongly that I define Zeppelin, despite their genre hopping, as a hard rock band. And if in fact Zeppelin are hard rock, the MC5 are not hard rock. I feel like it's sort of like, if Zeppelin is Pearl Jam taking it to a more modern day, then the MC5 are Black Flag. That's sort of the sonic difference. It's almost like indie rock versus corporate rock, despite there were no really independent labels then.
And that Zeppelin album is just very well produced.
Yeah,
and it's like,
as a big corporate rock band would be, right?
Right. And so it has that, this is the Ivy League versus the junior college student. This is it's just a more polished, presentable version, and but MC5 is like a more authentic, raw manifestation. They're just organic. They just, whereas Led Zeppelin is kind of like cultivated. They arrived where they were, whereas MC5 just like was born. It feels like.
Yeah. Yeah, the fact also that they chose to release a live album as their debut, I think is pretty interesting. Though all of those live records that began to build steam in the early 70s, from Deep Purple's Made in Japan to Frampton Comes Alive to Kiss Alive, all of those records, Cheap Trick at Budokan and UFO Strangers in the Night, and all of those big important live records. Kick Out the Jams is the rawest of all of them, and feels, and I don't know, but feels authentically live, where those big sort of arena rock bands were cheating, right? They were recording, they were overdubbing and recording tracks in the studio and overlaying audience sounds on top of it. So there is, and true to punk form, there is an authenticity, I think, with the MC5, despite that they're on Elektra Records. They seem like it has more in common with Husker Du's Land Speed record, the live record they released on SST in the early 80s, than it has in common with all of those big double live arena rock records of the 70s that would have been more kind of closely been the peers of the MC5 chronologically.
So really interesting that you pull Husker Du, because they're another band, and Bob Mould, that just occur to me as smart. Earnest, honest, authentic, organic, real, smart.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
really interesting that you pull that in there.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. I'm forever baffled, and this might even be some mini podcast someday, but I am forever baffled by the massive influence and reach that the tiny city of Detroit, Michigan has produced over the years. From Motown to the MC5 and the Stooges to Alice Cooper and Bob Seger to the White Stripes and Eminem. It is crazy how that little town has had such a massive musical imprint across genre. And it's almost all great. Ted Nugent. I mean, like, just like tons of just incredibly important, influential folks across various musical styles is really cool.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder why that is. I mean, what's the magic in the water?
I think the magic in the water is the same thing that was in the water in Birmingham, England, right? It's a hardcore industrial town where there were a lot of kids with nothing to do and down on their luck and really frustrated and trying to get the fuck out.
You know, I think that you're onto something. I remember hearing, early Metallica stories about how they were just into their music and they didn't have any money, and they'd go to the 7-Eleven or whatever and get a bologna and have a hand sandwich. They put the piece of bologna in their hand and eat it and go back to practicing. And it's like, that music of that era that they were making, you cannot can that. You cannot reproduce that. You cannot fake that. You have to be hungry. You have to, like, that comes from a place of strife and escape and desire to get out, right? Yeah. So I think you hit something there, because that would certainly do it, right? The same kind of industrial town that Birmingham is, with its motor industry. Birmingham, is a factory town, and I'm a motorcycle guy. I went to the motorcycle museum there, which is enormous and amazing. It's like a mecca of motorcycles. I think it's the biggest motorcycle collection in the world. And I was shocked. I did not realize how many motorcycles were manufactured in Birmingham. How many different brands came out of Birmingham, and that's just motorcycles. They had a whole industrial complex, and so having nowhere else to go but a factory, that's your option, right? It's this factory or that factory, or some supply chain that feeds this factory or that factory. And the downstream, what happens at home after working in a factory all day and being a kid in that home, and what does that home look like? Geezer Butler talked about not getting indoor plumbing until he was 8 or 10, and was like, why would people want to poop in their house? That seems so antithetical to him, right? He so used to having an outhouse, and in the 50s, right? Yeah. So, like, we got to bring ourselves all the way into that, and once we do, I think that that's a really chaotic and creative, and a driven cauldron.
Yeah, it's setting even aside how great those individual bands and artists are, but specifically how influential they were. Without the Stooges and the MC5, punk sounds completely different than it does today. Without Alice Cooper, theatrical arena rock is completely different. Without Eminem, in the 90s, hip hop today sounds very different. Without Motown, music broadly speaking is completely different. Like, just incredible shit coming out of that city.
Well, And I feel like that bridges the gap, right? Because if you're growing up in other parts of the country, you're not exposed to that level of chaos or creative underpinned energy that we're trying to iterate here. And you know, I had a professor a long time ago, well, in college a long time ago, who said that civilization is basically the rate of the exchange of ideas. And he was talking about how in Mesoamerica, at the same time in Europe, Europe was spread out, and the growing seasons and everything, just the way that the civilization was, the way population was very spread out. But in Mesoamerica, it was very temperate. And so there was this huge population, and people were literally running into each other. And so the rate of exchange of ideas allowed for this civilization boom to happen there when people were living in the mud in Europe. And it occurs to me that there's this similar exchange of ideas happening in a place like Detroit that then gets exported to the rest of the country and the rest of the world, who wouldn't have access to that level of density, that level of creative density and urge density. There's a kind of a two-pronged thing where you're creative, but you also have this impulse. You want to get out. You're hungry. Your options are limited.
Right.
So
let's
life is easier in a lot of places.
Yeah, let's pick it up there, and we're starting to run a little long. So the in the spirit of what you just described, in this collision and claustrophobia of shared ideas and influence, talk a little bit about how you feel Kick Out the Jams fits in this chronology. You know, we've crammed them in between Led Zeppelin and Captain Beefheart, which could not be more extremely different. So maybe it's appropriate that the MC5 sits in the middle of that. But just broadly speaking, how do you feel like this song fits in the heaviness that we are trying to figure out as we continue this conversation?
I think it's a connective tissue. Right. I think this is the kind of thing that connects Captain Beefheart and Led Zeppelin. And so it's really important for our discussion. It's very influential for music as a whole and our genre branch that we're talking about in particular. And it's this time. This time is a cauldron of ideas. So much is happening. So much is happening that is very, very different than the world order up to this point in kind of human memory, right? Because in the 60s, your grandparents' reality was different. You could have a grandparent that was born in the 1880s or 1890s in 1969, right? They'd be old, but it could happen.
Right.
So they're closer to that than than they are to us in 2025. Or about as close, I guess. Anyway, that's that. It's important to be here because of the time that we're talking about, and because they connect so much of what we're talking about and what we're going to talk about.
Right. Yeah, I agree. You know, it's an interesting time for sure. You know, we started talking about adulthood as it relates to some of these subgenres and this music that these people are creating. Back on the King Crimson episode, I think we started talking about that. And since then, we've had Led Zeppelin, which is very musically mature, even though playing to very young people. The MC5, as we just discussed, very heady, big adult ideas being presented by this band through their political leanings and the White Panther Party, and even their lyrics and stances and things like zines ads aimed at department stores. And the next week we're gonna stay very adult and get really fucking weird with Captain Beefheart and it's going to be, I think, similar to our Velvet Underground conversation, where we figure out where kind of the artiness kind of perspective and the really strange, we've touched on Zappa a few times, where that fits into all of heavy. So we'll get into that. I think it's interesting. Kick Out the Jams is much more raw and emotional, regardless of how smart and adult the band was. The song, very emotional and straightforward. So we're going to see how it does tonight in Song v Song. Every week we pit our current champion against the night's current topic. Dave strayed a little bit from the fray a little bit last week. My champion remains the Beatles. I Want You, She's So Heavy, back from episode 14. Dave, however, leaned into Zeppelin, and Dazed and Confused from last week is your current reigning heavy song of the moment. How is Dazed and Confused going to fare against the MC5's Kick Out the Jams, Dave?
I'm taking it through another week.
Okay.
I'm just such a fan of the electric heavy blues, and again, it was a razor's edge between She's So Heavy and Dazed and Confused. But after not hearing it for many years and hearing it again, it really I really like that song.
Yeah.
So it's going to be my reigning champion.
Okay. I share that same sentiment as it pertains to Kick Out the Jams. And despite the fact that the Beatles are maybe my favorite band of all time, maybe the greatest band that ever lived, a much more regular listen for me and a much deeper listen across discography, as it pertains to this topic of heavy, man, I just fucking love Kick Out the Jams. So I am gonna take Kick Out the Jams. Yeah, we have an upset.
I am really shocked. I was wondering what was gonna dethrone the Huntsman favorite Beatles, because you've mentioned on the show many times you listen to the Beatles every week.
Yeah,
and how often do you listen to MC5?
I mean, I hear Kick Out the Jams, not the band, this specific song I hear, I don't know, once every few months at most, probably. But again, under the umbrella of heavy, I just love it so dearly. But I will say, I think Kick Out the Jams is going to be a pretty strong champ for me in the coming weeks. But there are a few bands coming up that I also listen to weekly and almost daily. So there's going to be some real challengers come up, but I know there's there's a big elephant in the room headed our way. So we'll get to that in a few episodes, but it won't be next week. Next week, again, we will be talking about Captain Beefheart and all of his zaniness. We will be talking about Dachau Blues, which is a very weird song, but a fucking awesome song. So I'm very excited to talk about that. In the meantime, check us out on Instagram and YouTube if you're not on YouTube. And also check out our Spotify playlist that I mentioned earlier. That is simply the History of Heavy podcast on Spotify. And until next week, stay heavy, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Bye.